you notice that it didn't work like most OpenID providers because we just didn't say enter your URL. You just clicked the login button, it did it all in the background. The thing that was nice about that, if there was a big problem in OpenID or OAuth or these other open standards, Google, Facebook, etc. would release a notice and patch it, and we could follow them. Which leads me to the next one, which is how do we stand on the shoulders of these giants? A lot of you guys in the audience are also giants, and we stand on your shoulders as well, and so that's really one of the most important things for me. Another one that I think is talked about a little less is hiring. Both people who contribute to open source and people who are building on open source are easier hires than if they don't. If someone says, well, I've never contributed to open source, or let's say this a little differently. My favorite interview question right now is, what's your GitHub URL? People give it to me and you can instantly kind of get an idea of how and who and what these people are. What are they working on? What's important to them? And it honestly doesn't matter if they're a designer or a C hacker. Their contributions to open source, whether it's documentation or whether it's actual kernel patches, are very important. And you can see this very easily with Bitbucket, with GitHub, with any of these sites that allow us to see what they're working on. I find this fascinating. And that is one of the only ways that we found good engineers so fast on the campaign, was instantly seeing the source code that they were committing in public. It also shows what kind of person they are and how they are acting. And so this goes back to your projects that you have hidden away in your computers. Publish those, and it's kind of like a Field of Dreams thing, but it's instead of weird ghost baseball players, I guess you get companies coming to hire you. That was a terrible analogy, wasn't it? Not invented here is something that we say oftentimes negatively about an organization who has a not invented here problem where they won't use that software. Well, this is the opposite for me, which is I love it if I don't have to do any work, right? Like, it's awesome. Like, I would die if I had to write a web server before every time we hacked some web app. I mean, that'd be terrible. And then I look at Node, right? And you're like, what? But it's like, why do you do this? I mean, and actually, some of the best web servers have built on top of other great web technologies. My favorite example of this is Tornado, which looked at kind of what Twisted was doing, what all these things were doing, and said, wait, we can build a better Python web server. And then that really set the tone for asynchronous web connections and web sockets for, and that was quite a while ago. But I try and only use things that we didn't invent, because I know that I'm not actually good at code and tech, I'm good at product. And so putting all these things together and kind of putting this puzzle together to build something that is awesome is really what we try and do. So obviously open source is awesome, right? But there's some things I want to just challenge you guys. So one of the things that's really important is understand what you're using. So really look at it and think, what is the license here? Be deliberate about the license. Is it supported? Be deliberate about whether or not it's supported. GitHub helps with this. You can see when the last commit is. You'll get tracked. So you need to be conscious. You need to be deliberate about these things. You need to respect open source. I wanted to talk about, but I didn't get a chance to, open sourcing things, because that's where I think a lot of this respect really needs to be placed. It's oftentimes more expensive than people think to open source things. Some of the saddest things out there are projects that have been abandoned, and usually that's because the original open sourcing of it didn't have the support it needed. So please respect open source. So that's pretty much it. Remember, this is all very simple. Build a great team, practice failure, and use open source, and above all, ship. So thank you. I would love to answer a bunch of questions. I don't know if we have a mic. I'll just repeat the question. So, questions? Yeah?
If you're rebuilding threadless today, what kind of stack would it be?
That's a good question. So the question was, if I was rebuilding threadless today, what kind of stack would it be? That's really hard, because both my kind of like hacker nerd side says I want to use Go, the language, because it's fun. But my practical, someone else is going to have to do this later side probably says Python. And the reason for that is hosting has gotten easier for all of these things. So whether it's AWS or OpenStack once you get big, or Heroku or EngineYard or App Engine once you're small, Python is pretty well supported. I probably wouldn't choose Rails because I'm very bad at Ruby. But if I got better at Ruby, maybe I would choose Rails, because it seems like it works pretty well. Yeah?
What did you do before threadless, and what led to that?
The question is, what did I do before Threadless? I was hoping no one would ask that. I was a criminal. I was a Java programmer. I was a Java programmer, and I worked for a company called World Book Publishing. And then I just did a lot of side projects. And so I did, I don't know if you guys remember the 3Com Audrey. Anyone remember the 3Com Audrey? It's sad. This is like tears. In the early 2000s, there was a 3Com Audrey, and it was a little Palm Pilot kind of device. And so I built a community for that, and then I built communities for hacking cell phones for a bunch of years, and then did some ringtone stuff. And it's really a dark world that I try not to talk about. I just try to replace it with that one slide that has a couple dots on it and just hope no one asks. Yeah, another follow-up?
Yeah, just the reason that I asked is, you get A players hire A players and it's building a great team, but there are a lot of people that are not in an ideal situation trying to build a great team, right?
Yep.
Where you're not surrounded by A players, but you're going to try and attract A players to a non-A player culture.
Yep, I think the question is, how do you attract A players to a non-A player culture? I think a lot of this goes into, I probably didn't describe it well, but the always be closing. One of the things that I've found is when you're especially trying to hire engineers, whether it's to a product, to collaborate, or to whatever, one of the most important things is telling a compelling story. And there's a great book called Drive by Daniel Pink, and a lot of it talks about motivation and why people are doing things. And I'm guessing it's not usually for money. I wasn't going to put a hands up thing, but I did it if I wouldn't go very well. But it's usually, people aren't usually doing these things for money. I certainly have found myself wishing I was. I definitely have friends who are, but for the most part, the engineers I'm hiring usually, or the people I'm working with, they're not there for the financial reward. They're there because the problem is interesting. And the interesting problem could be, help me get out of the culture of B's and C's. Like, that could be the pitch. And so there's a lot that you can do on building on what you have and just saying, hey, we need to solve this problem. And that's worked well for me. And it hasn't always been as easy. I mean, hiring for the presidential campaign was pretty much yes or wrong team. Like, that was pretty much it. But, so that doesn't count as much. But just even finding, interactions or trying to find people to collaborate with, it's all about the pitching and selling of the problem. Yeah?
How long did it take you to hire your team?
So the question is, how long did it take me to hire my team? On the campaign, we did about 40 people in about 3 months, which was ridiculous. The campaign also hired about 7,500 people in about 9 months, which I think is also ridiculous. And we once onboarded 100 interns in one day, which was like stacking firewood. Yeah?
What's the license on the campaign product?
The license on the campaign product, so the question is about the campaign product. The campaign product is not released. I am pushing for MIT. I figured that one's about the most reasonable license that we can do for something that could be used for commercial use. Other questions? Yeah?
You said you go to Python now. Do you feel like PHP is dead?
The question is about Python versus PHP. Absolutely not. I think that PHP is an incredibly viable language for anything. I just haven't been doing it very, very often, so I check out Kohana and I'm just like, what is going on? And they have this new installer for packages. What is this called? Like a Composer or some shit like that? What is it? You know what I'm talking about? Is it Composer?
You're talking about Pear?
Well, Pear too, but Composer is the one. Yeah, it's for installing PHP packages, and I just don't know how to use it. And I just, for whatever reason, I can't figure it out. I keep trying. I would love someone to tell me. PHP, so PHP really did power all of our fundraising on the campaign. And so when people say, PHP won't work for important applications, that's about as important as you can get, and about as sensitive since you're dealing with credit cards, personal information, and it's a latency, a low latency application. And so we had Python, we had Ruby, we had C, and we chose PHP for the finance apps. That was also because we knew it could be fast and it scales easy. You don't have to use app servers. So I would choose it again, and I think it's it's one of the things I think is really important is not thinking about the tools, thinking about the solutions. And so if you're thinking about whether PHP or Python is better, you're probably in the wrong place. Yeah?
How do you stay up to date with the latest open source projects out there?
Question is, how do I stay up to date with the latest open source products? I sadly rely on my friends. I should say I sadly don't So I rely on my friends. I should phrase that differently instead of saying I sadly rely on my friends. But what I found is there was a time when I was able to really keep up with the open source world, and a lot of that was through conferences and going and like just going to all of the sessions. And that's how I met Mark, and that's how I met many people at like the MySQL conferences, which I spent a lot of time with at. And what I found is going to places like this, these type of conferences that are more general, where people are talking about all the technologies, you get to hear great things like about Freedom Box and about all of these things, rather than going to the very specific ones. Now with that said, some of the best, I think, discovery that I've ever done has been at the MySQL conference back when it was hot. And the reason that was because it was such a nugget in the middle of a lot of people's infrastructures that you'd have good conversations about the surrounding orbits and not just that one. And so if there's, probably the Hadoop conferences might be similar to this. The other thing is I love clicking on Explore in GitHub. You can find all sorts of interesting things there. Yeah?
Do you have any recommendations on how to get people excited about civic hacking?
No. I sort of do. So the problem with civic hacking in politics, if you guys ever want to go into it, is that it totally blows. That's because it just sucks. It's like you just are beating your head against a wall over and over again. And it's because most of them are huge, monolithic institutions that invested sadly in Oracle like 5 years ago. And they're just like, well, until that's paid for, we're not changing anything. And so this is how you do it. And it's very simple. You make it short term. So you just say, for the next 12 months, you'll be helping in this world. And that way, every day when it sucks, you're like, well, there's light at the end of the tunnel. And that's honestly how we did it with the campaign, which it wasn't that the technology was bad, it was really intense. And that's how we do it in Chicago with our civic hacking stuff. The other thing that I believe in is oftentimes you can get people excited with civic hacking by just doing it. And so I reverse engineered the CTA, the transit application, or the API for Chicago, and just published it. You have to be careful because you can go to jail sometimes. So just, be wary. But if you're in a place that you feel is helpful, for instance, I knew some of the CTA people, and so I was able to tell them right away what we had done, and so that would have been a simple conversation like, hey, you shouldn't do that, instead of like a cease and desist or something more nefarious and chilling. Yeah?
How much of the all the stuff that you built at OFA with your team, how much of that do you think will be repurposed for future elections?
That's a good question. So the question is, how much of what we built at OFA will be repurposed for future elections? Sadly, it's software, so bit rot is very real. If we were going to run an election in 2011, it would be perfect. But there's a few things there's a few like DevOps tools and some more kind of like middle technology tools that I think will really help. And that will help everyone, not just campaigns. What I really hope people take away, like the Democrats or the Republicans, they're both talking about it, and they're both going to be struggling with the same issues in 2016. What I hope the takeaway is about the people and the process, about using iterative development. For instance, when I walked into the campaign, there was no version control. So that's kind of where they were, and I'm pretty sure that's where a lot of these organizations are. The DNC did have a Git repo, but they weren't using GitHub. They weren't using collaborative tools. So introducing that, I think that's kind of the culture virus that I would like to continue more than the software. Yeah?
How did your work relate to Vote Builder and its?
So Vote Builder, the question is, how did my work relate to Vote Builder? So Vote Builder is a kind of a CRM for progressive politics that the Democrats use quite a bit. We integrated aggressively with Vote Builder and shared data between Vote Builder and my own software, or my team's software. So that's kind of how we did it. Van's great. It looks like it's built with the Visual Studio Visual Designer, like drag and drop, but it works like a beast. I've never said that about a Microsoft product before. It's not Microsoft, but it was built with .NET. Yeah?
My question, I want to try to word it right, but like I'm sure the technological challenge of going into that campaign and doing that software was amazing. But then you also have the ideological, if the Republicans had asked to do the same thing and you'd never gotten that other opportunity, would you take it for the technology even if you didn't necessarily agree with the result? Or how much of that played into the...
So the question is, how much of the ideology, I think, did the engineers, like, would we do it if it was an opportunity, would you go for the other side? Many of the people we hired were there for the candidate. A lot of them weren't even really identified as Democrats. They just identified as people who supported the president, which I find is a big distinction. I have many friends who worked on Romney, and I think it was very much similar for them. So I think that the ideology kind of is important for that, especially because it's such a big and crazy thing that you're doing, and it's really hard. I think it has to match. Now, with that said, I think there are a lot of opportunities to do products like this where your ideology doesn't necessarily match. I don't know if that answers your question, but it is a very hard question. I think it's almost a personal choice. Personally, I was a supporter of the president, so I knew that I wanted to do it. But that leads to the next question of would I do another campaign, and there's no way.
I guess it would tie in with the team.
Yeah, oh yeah,
You know,
no.
when you're building a team, if they don't connect, they may love the challenge, but they may
Yep.
not connect with the ideology
And
of
so
how
this-
you're doing it.
So this goes a little bit to like, how do you build a good team and that kind of question, which is, we need to share values. Now, hopefully you guys aren't doing national campaigns, so you can work on a small project and you can share values that are a little bit less political. But sharing values is really important. And so we all knew, and the people I hired, we all agreed that we should be building big software that used platforms, and that we were gonna focus aggressively on APIs, and we were gonna use open standards and all this stuff. And so we looked for people that knew that, both in our search and when we hired people, brought them in, we made sure that they supported that. And so that kind of, we shared this open source and open standards ideology. And a lot of the work we did to integrate with Vote Builder or BSD, we tried to push out standards that we built internally that we hoped would live on. And so a lot of that ideology was matching no matter where you came from. And I think that's important that for a team to really gel like that. I mean, and it's probably as hard as, you know, if two people disagree on language. You know, I mean, it's just not going to work very well. So you should use Go. Yeah.
Particularly given that you said you had some friends that were working on the Romney campaign, do you have any insight as to the just massive IT infrastructure fail those guys experienced?
Yeah, I mean, I don't. I can just honestly probably talk shit. Really, what happened was it was a lack of empowerment of the technologists. And you have to look at what the landscape was. We started, we had 18 months. They really had 3 or 4. So this is why I think 2016 is going to be very similar to what the Republicans went through, is because there isn't a foundational technology for either side. And when I talked to my friends that were inside of the Romney campaign, what they talked about was a lack of investment. So this young kid would build a cool product, and then it would get nixed by the political group. You know, whereas we would have a young kid build a cool product, and then it would be looked at by the campaign manager. So that's kind of, I think, a big difference. And it was just, we chose to really invest in technology at a very, very early time period where they kind of, I think, just now are realizing how important it is to invest and empower technologists. Now, with that said, technology is only a force multiplier in these situations. It is never the reason. And so you have to remember that as well. And that's my worry for 2016, that the narrative that comes off of the campaign will be that technology should be the focus. Yeah, in the back.
Are there any startups out there right now that you would use as a benchmark for team dynamics? Or?
Yeah, this is a really good question. Are there startups that I use as a benchmark for team dynamics? I think the #1 engineering team in the country is Etsy. Number 2, for an interesting reason, is Palantir. They're all hackers. And since I do client work, a lot of it is very fast, insane hacking work to do. So it's interesting to see what they're doing. But by far, #1 is Etsy. I'm very excited about Stripe. Stripe is doing very cool stuff, and they're building a very smart team. And then I'm constantly surprised by Dropbox, which I think is going to be the new Google for hiring. Probably not search, but you never know. Yeah.
You talked about trying to get narwhal released. So that's probably the example in most competitive space possible. So how in really competitive industries do you encourage companies to release source code and
Yeah, this
embrace
is
open source code?
This is a really good question. How do in competitive industries, why should you release your code? I think there's a couple things that you can do. When I look at open source, I look at it as almost one of the best recruiting tools out there. And so I would not release your most competitive piece of software, but you can release a lot of things surrounding it. A great example of this is automation. So if you have a big app, like look, Airbnb releases great automation tools all the time. So does Stripes. So does, my favorite is, I don't know how many of you guys play Minecraft. Mindfold is this Minecraft server, the young kid does. Anyway, Mindfold, they release all this stuff about Minecraft, like how to, like Minecraft bots, all this stuff. So it's not their core technology, but it's the auxiliary technology around it. And what it does is it attracts people to their product that are like us, so we go in there and we're like, oh, that's really awesome, I should use Airbnb. But more importantly, it gives them, if more people adopt it, like StatsD and Graphite came from Etsy. If people adopt it, we can commit a patch back that solves our problem that may solve some other people's problem. So I got time for one more question. Yeah, right in the front.
What's next for you?
What's next for me? Any other questions? So, what's next for me? I'm still trying to figure that out. I have a small team and we have a small company, and we're focusing on commerce. I used to say we're focusing on enterprise, which is still true, but more on the commerce side. So if you play that back, you heard I just didn't say anything. We're trying to figure out what the future of commerce looks like and kind of what are some of the exciting things that we can do with the internet and buying things. So, yeah, probably I have time for one half of a question since that one is the easy one. Okay, half of a question.
I just have a quick
That's
question.
it?
As a student, how can I convince, I get open source, I understand it, love it, great idea. How can I get faculty, students, other people to understand why open source needs to be brought into our curriculum, why it's so important? How can we convince the naysayers?
What age? Or what is it college?
It is.
Probably find the person that's working closest to get the contracts with Microsoft and convince them. Because usually a lot of the FUD is coming from corporate. Because I guarantee that a lot of your comp sci students would be thrilled to do that, mostly because it's free and accessible. And right now it's not necessarily, I think, about piracy, it's more about what is accessible. And there's a lot of accessible open source software. Because of that, a lot of the corporate and licensed software has a vested interest in trying to move into our schools. You may remember the Coke machines of our elementary schools. I think that's it. Thank you, everyone. It was great to chat, and I'd love to chat later.
Okay, that was awesome. Let's go ahead and prepare for a break. The next thing we have